Hello and welcome to the Choose FI podcast. Don't worry, your ears are not playing tricks on you today. My name is Aaron, a friend and neighbor of Brad and a longtime listener of the Choose FI podcast. And today the tables are turned. We're putting Brad on the hot seat today to talk FI, his story, his experience, what he would do differently, and maybe a few hot seat questions.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
So Brad, welcome to the show today.
Yeah, welcome to my own show. I like this. Thank you for doing the intro. That was very cool. And yeah, what's very funny here is you are, quite literally my almost next door neighbor. You're about 100 yards from me as we're recording this, but we're in our houses. And yeah, you had the idea a couple of months ago, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I interviewed you? And I thought it was a great idea. And yeah, I'm so happy we're making this happen. So the show is all yours today.
You know, it's pretty impressive, Brad, to think back. And we were talking this morning about our introduction when our girls started kindergarten. And I remember that fall stepping onto the soccer field at some fall festival. I'm like, oh, hey, Brad, Aaron, nice to meet you. What do you do? And you told me that day about the podcast. So we were tracing back, and I think that was within the first 100 episodes. So congratulations on more than 400 now.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think with those roundups, I think we're actually close to 600, if you'd believe it, which is insane. Our numbering system is kind of baffling. So yeah, I get confused sometimes. But yeah, it's been wild. It's hard to believe our girls have known each other for so long, and yeah, that you've been listening to the podcast for 5+ years now. It's hard to believe anybody's been listening to the podcast for 5+ years that it's existed that long. It's been quite a journey, that's for sure.
Well, it's been a good one, and I've learned a lot from you. I know as we've listened to the stories and the end of year recap from 2022, there were lots of incredible stories and growth opportunities, things that people have put into practice in their own lives. So I'm excited today to turn the mic back to you and ask you some questions, dive into a little bit more of your story, what you've experienced along the way, because obviously we get bits and pieces here and there, and you contribute your story all throughout this podcast experience. But there's something different about putting you on the hot seat. So let's dive right in to the deep.
Right.
A couple episodes ago, in episode 417, in the wrap up on 2022, you and MK were talking about year-end wins. And one of the things that jumped out to me was her story. And she said in her FI journey, she built that FI pathway before her kids were born. And so now she's getting to enjoy their early years while living out FI. We met obviously at a point after that. So I wasn't even in a place to build a FI journey before kids. So, I wonder what I would have done differently if I had known FI earlier in my life. And this question is truly what started my podcast and my book, asking leaders, what lesson do you wish you had learned earlier in your life? So back to you and FI. What do you know now about FI that you wish you had known 20 years ago?
Ooh. Oh, that's a good one, Aaron. I thought you were going to go somewhere different in that, what was the decision you made that you thought was the launching point? And maybe I could answer my own question there too, but what do I wish that I knew? So, it's interesting. I think the education or the knowledge finds the student when they're ready for it to a large degree. And I think some of the stuff that I've come across recently has been revolutionary for my life and my FI journey, but I don't know if I would have been ready for it. So 20 years ago would have put me essentially right out of college, basically. And I guess what I'm learning now is, like, let's say a book like Die with Zero, which I've mentioned a bunch of times. For anybody who hasn't read it, it's just a great message I think actually Bill Perkins has been on the author has been on a couple of podcasts, Peter Attia's Drive and All the Hacks here in the last couple of months. And those might even be better, frankly, than reading the book. But it just has given me a better understanding for the concept of spending money and spending it. So actually counterintuitively, right? Or what many would jokingly think is counterintuitive for the Phi world, because I think Phi has this connotation of it's all about cutting. It's all about saving, which then has these connotations of being miserly, deprivation. It's all these negative things that we've tried to dispel. And I think, Aaron, that we've done a pretty good job of it over the last 6 years. But at its essence, I think Phi is about making choices. And at the beginning of those choices for most people, it does mean cutting some things. It means saving, and it might mean doing things that are a little outside of their comfort zone. So that being said, where this message of Die with Zero comes in is you have to take a hard look at your life and say, all right, I'm going to live 80, 90 plus years, maybe if I'm lucky. And am I going to be healthy, like to travel around, or as Bill Perkins likes to say, go wakeboarding when I'm 77, right? Like, probably not. What about 70? Maybe, maybe not. What about 65? And you can keep playing that game with a lot of these things that you want to do in life. And then you get down to, oh, wow, maybe your 40s and 50s, and hopefully, if you're in good shape, most of your 60s are the time to do those things, as opposed to, oh, I'm going to be worth $100 million, doing my crazy compound. And this is not my number, clearly, but like our crazy compounding of like, oh, when I'm 97, I'm going to be worth 100 million. And then if I live another 9 years, it's 200 million because it'll double. Well, that's all well and good. But if that means that you didn't have the life that you wanted, or you talked about our kids, right? As I've also mentioned so many times, the website Wait But Why has that incredible article and really set of infographics, and it's called The Tail End. And it basically shows the amount of time you get to spend with people. And really, it's talking about both your parents, the time you spend with your parents, but really the time you get to spend with your kids. And I think it's somewhere on the order of like 92% of the time you'll ever spend with your kids are from 0 to 18 when they go to college. 92%, Aaron. That's crazy time when you think about it. And it makes you realize, oh, wow, for me, I have a high schooler. That means I'm in the 70% plus for my older daughter, Anna. 70+% of the time I'll ever spend with her is already gone. So I've got to grasp these last couple of years. So yeah, this is a very long answer to your question. But I think for me, that understanding of time and just how finite it is, and that because we've laid our financial ground game so significantly, we can afford to let the purse strings a little looser than maybe we would have done. And as I've said so many times, we're not living deprivation at all. I mean, you know this. We live in a nice upper middle class suburb and we're living great lives. But maybe instead of spending when I'm 72, when I'm 43, to take that extra trip or do that extra thing, even if it's a little outside of my comfort zone, I think it's a no-brainer. And I would have missed that in my 20s and probably for most of my 30s too.
Yeah, I hear you talking. It's almost the myths of Phi is probably another episode all on its own. But that idea of cutting and deprivation to eliminate the things that we actually want. And there's a balance there. And you're right. I think there's a balance to what we learn and when we learn it. And that's exactly when it needs to be learned. And that's part of our life journey and our experience. And I think we've all gotten a glimpse of that. I mean, you've shown us hundreds of different ways of doing Phi by the various guests you've had on this show. And I think that's a testament to, it's not a one way is the right way. It's how are you using these questions and frameworks and decision making to make your best decision?
Yeah, I love that. And it is a framework. And that's why, like you said, the myths of Phi, or maybe put another less charitable way, would be the caricature of Phi, right? Which is, okay, it's these people eating brown bananas from that famous, whatever it was, Wall Street Journal article that still annoys me to this day, or just cutting and living these, essentially horrible lives and wishing away 10 or 15 years just to get to this point. And that's not the goal of what we're doing here. And it's funny because I've been thinking a lot about people like Dave Ramsey, who's done just marvelous work for this world, clearly. But he's very concrete about those 7 baby steps. You know what you're getting. And I think one of the beauties of Phi, but I think from like a marketing standpoint, if you will, and I say that very kind of tongue in cheek, you don't know exactly what you're getting with Phi, right? Because there are so many options. So it's a beautiful, wonderful thing that this truly is personal. It's about taking action, but there's no doctrine. There's no doctrine at all. It's just, okay, you clearly have to figure out, you have a finite amount of income, though you can grow that income, and you have things you spend on. If you spend all of your income, you are going to have a net worth of zero or more likely negative, and that's not palatable. So it is about making choices. And yeah, like you're saying, there are so many choices to make, and that makes it both exciting, but even from my perspective, it makes it daunting to how do you describe this as something that this is a life superpower, but to a large degree, you're on your own to figure out what that looks like in your own life.
Right. And one of the tools that I use in my work with leaders gets at how our minds work. Some of us are dreamers, some of us are visionaries, some of us are ideators, some of us are very practical. And so it comes down to, what questions are you trying to answer before you start your journey? What are you trying to get in place? And that overwhelm can definitely come in and get us stuck with any decision. So with all the possibilities of Phi, it could be easy to get stuck and not take that first step. But that's one of the examples I love from Dave Ramsey's work, is the snowball effect. Just as the visual and thinking, hey, let's build some momentum. What's my first quick win? So let me ask the question that you've already asked yourself. What was that first step for you?
Yeah. So the first big step, or the transformative step, was moving from Long Island down to Richmond. Without question, end of story, hard stop. That was the decision that really transformed everything and enabled the life that we're currently living. Because like you said, with MK, kind of coming up with this plan before her daughter was born, that really is to a large degree what my wife Laura and I did, which was, we were in our mid 20s at that point. We were, I think, 25, 26 when we got married, thereabouts. And somehow or another, we had the wherewithal to say, okay, we're both CPAs. We can make a life here on Long Island in this high cost of living area. We can, obviously. We're working at this major international firm. We could potentially be senior managers or partners someday. But is that what we actually want? And it was a really big step to basically pick up and leave our family and friends, the only place we'd ever known, and move 400 miles away. But it was done in service of this future life. I like to joke, it's my future fictional kids at that point. That's what this was. But it was, we want to be able to have one of us stay home when we have these kids. I don't know how or where that thought came from, to be honest, Aaron, but what that meant in practical terms was, we need to save 50% of our income at the absolute worst. And even that would not have been good enough in our eyes, because we wouldn't have wanted to live on the edge. But at the very least, table stakes, bare minimum is, we need to be saving 50% of our income, just by definition, because if one of those incomes is going to go away, hey, you got to figure this out. So that was not going to be plausible on Long Island. It just would have been impossible. So yeah, we came down here, which is, as many people know, I went to the University of Richmond, as did you, which is super cool. So I did have a couple of friends still from college down here, and it was a pretty soft landing. But that said, it was still very difficult to pick up your entire life. All of our extended family is within 10 miles of each other, or were about 10 miles apart on Long Island, and friends were still there. So yeah, that's the big step. And I guess just kind of going back, since you specifically asked, the first step would be, I think Laura and I, when we both started our jobs, so at 22, essentially, we both lived at home. And it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought about the through line of really housing, but not trying to look cool. Because I had a lot of friends, and as did Laura, who the second they graduated from college, they rented an apartment. And that might have been in New York City, which was extraordinarily expensive, or on Long Island, which is not that much less expensive, though, naturally somewhat decent, but less expensive. But they wanted to be these independent adults and look how great I am. But I mean, that's really expensive, especially on an entry-level salary. And maybe for me, like the big lesson is, when you don't care what other people think, you can potentially make decisions that get you so far ahead of the game that they're outsized decisions for what they seem like at the time. Because my ability to save 80 to 98% of my income, and Laura's the same for those first 2 years, really set up everything, because then I was able to buy my first property and was able to sell it a couple years later for a fairly small but not insignificant profit. So it was all these little dominoes. So I kind of started the story backwards. But yeah, it was the saving money, living at home. It was the buying that first place. It was then selling that and then moving down to Richmond. And I mean, really, like from there on, honestly, if we had just done that and then kept driving old cars, I know this sounds almost flippant when I say it this way, but like if we had just done those things and then just kind of coasted in, we probably still would be at or near Phi right now, just from those couple little decisions. And those not insignificant. I don't mean to to laugh off moving 400 miles, but it's not like this was we're living on rice and beans and brown bananas. It's just we're driving nice cars that happen to be a little bit older, and we're living in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in, as you know, one of the nicest parts of the Richmond metro area, but it just didn't cost that much.
Right. And you and Laura were decades ahead of the curve. I mean, new data out this week showing just how many DC and New York residents are moving to Richmond. So there's definitely a geographic factor there. I mean, geo arbitrage even within the lower 48. And it is those little decisions that do make a big difference. So as you look, you talked about a few of these decisions. And I'm curious, mining even farther back in your story, go back to when you were a kid. What were your lessons? What was your worldview, or I guess your Phi view, even though you didn't have the vocabulary or the language? What lessons did you learn as a kid?
Yeah, I've got a couple that jump to mind. So yeah, let me kind of meander through this this little journey. So I think I was always I wasn't entrepreneurial growing up necessarily, but I think I was always somehow like money minded. So I was big into comic books and baseball cards, actually. So this was probably, trying to place it, like early 90s, like very, very early 90s. And that was coincided with a big boom in comic books and baseball cards. But I always thought of them, whether right or wrong, as like investments. And I was always looking at the prices. And I actually wound up getting my first job at a comic book and baseball card store. I don't know if I've ever actually said that. As like a 14-year-old kid, I was the assistant manager of the store, which is super cool. And yeah, I mean, I tried to save my money. I don't have any like great stories other than I still have these comic books. And what's funny is in recent years, actually large part from Gary Vaynerchuk, of all people, who's kind of repopularized them as collectibles. There's actually some value to some of these things. So I've held them over this 30-year period where they were essentially worthless, and then now they're back to being worth something. So yeah, I just was always like, there's this funny story in my family of like, my brother had a broken leg. This shows like maybe what a terrible person I am, to be perfectly honest, but he had like a broken leg, and I wound up driving up to the comic book store to buy him his whatever cards that week or something. And I got a 10% discount for being the assistant manager, and I pocket the money as opposed to, I took it as like a delivery fee. You know, I've gotten a lot of flack for that over the last 30 years. But anyway, not anything altogether interesting there, but it just kind of seeds that like I've always been thinking about this stuff. But I guess for me, the two actual big things, like in my pre or just about pre-college years, where the first, I mean, really was the college decision in general, which was, and it always feels like kind of weird to say, but like I got accepted to some ultra elite colleges. So I got into Duke and Cornell, and then obviously incredible schools, as you well know, like University of Richmond and Wake Forest, but not exactly on the level of Duke. But at that point, it was, and this sounds so quaint now, Aaron, but I think at the time, those schools were like $30,000 a year, like all in. And I couldn't wrap my mind around coming out of school with significant debt. And this was like 1997 when I'm making this decision, but it didn't make sense to me. I always thought that I was the one who would be successful regardless of my environment if I put in hard work and it was what was intrinsic to me. I didn't need that reputational thing. And I certainly didn't want to walk away with $60,000 to $90,000 of debt or whatever it would have been. And clearly this is not an oh poor me scenario, because the University of Richmond is like a top 50 university. So nobody's crying for me, and that it is an amazing school. Truly, for anybody who hasn't heard of it, it is remarkable. So well worth looking into. And it was an environment that I wanted to be in. It was a small environment. It was somewhere where I could actually be somebody as opposed to just a number or somebody, frankly, below average at Duke or Cornell. And I wound up getting a little bit of money. I forget precisely what type of like mini scholarship it was, but it wasn't anything on the order of a half tuition or full tuition scholarship. But it wound up at that time, U of R was very inexpensive. And I wound up getting out of there with under, I think it was like $5,000 of debt, or 5 to 8,000. It was minuscule.
Wow.
Right. Which is crazy. Right. And you think about that, getting an accounting degree from the University of Richmond, and the accounting department there is one of the top 5 or 10 in the whole country, with essentially zero debt. So that one decision when I was a 17-year-old kid, going against what everything society says, which is go to the elite place, tell everybody for the rest of your life that you went to Duke. I didn't make that decision. And I reaped the benefits of that for, literally now for decades. I didn't have to pay that back. So there's that, which is a big thing. And I don't think I've ever really gone into that in that kind of depth. But the one that I have mentioned a bunch of times is when I was 19, I had this like internship. My aunt, who's incredible, she's worked as an administrative assistant for stockbrokers or financial advisors at some big firms for decades now, was incredible and got me a summer internship. And the actual internship wound up being just mostly cold calling, which was horrible, and kind of gave me an insight into the financial advisory business at a very young age. So maybe that was actually something big. But one of the advisors was incredible and sat me down in front of a compound interest calculator. And he let me just sit at his computer and just play around with it. It was the lightning bolt for me. That was a true lightning bolt. At the time, I think the Roth IRA or IRA contribution limits was $2,000. And it was like, okay, I'm 19. I can put in $2,000 for the next 10 years. And by the time and again, going back to the 99 years old or something, it was like $1 billion if it grew at 12%, annually. But clearly that's ridiculous. I wasn't going to be a billionaire off of a Roth IRA, but it showed me that compounding and just how remarkable this can be. And I think once you see a compound interest calculator and once you understand it, you can almost never go back. You can't unsee that. So yeah, I give you 3 little things from my background.
But I think there's something in even your college story, your college choice, where you decided to go to school, that goes back to our earlier conversation of each step informing the next step. And you can make that leap. And I hear this all the time. I mean, our girls are headed into middle school. Your youngest, my oldest. And as part of that journey, even choosing classes, it's the long range view of where's your destination going, and starting to explore what do you want to study and what do you want to choose as your career, and all of these path decisions. And I think when we talk about that, I remember this quote from one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. And he talks about the difference between being the small fish in the big pond or the big fish in the small pond. And I believe in that so strongly, because when you're the big fish in the small pond and going to a small school like Richmond, my wife went to an even smaller school where she knew everyone, and professors and administrators still know her now, 20 years later. And it's those kinds of small steps that I think along the way help propel us forward and give us in personal life compound growth.
I totally agree. And yeah, that was David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. I read that and I remember it very specifically because, I think the person in question, or one of the people, went to, it was either medical school or it was in like pre-med at either Dartmouth or Brown. And they were objectively brilliant, but they were, I guess, relatively below average in their class, which is ridiculous. Whereas had they gone, or I think if they dropped out and they went to a less prestigious, because I won't say worse, I don't think those things are true, of like the academic quality, but a less prestigious place where they were the absolute most intelligent person or top of their class, or however you want to phrase it, they succeeded wildly. And I think there's something to that. I think you also need to know yourself. That's a big part. It's not to say that big fish in small pond is the right answer for everybody, right? And I think there is a right answer depending on you and your situation. Do you want a small school? Do you want a big school, et cetera? For me, the small school was the best decision. I wound up being the vice president of the student government. I was involved. I knew really this Professor Hoyle, who is one of the top accounting professors. He may be the single best accounting professor in the whole country for the last 3 decades. And he's someone who I went out to lunch with a number of times after graduation. I mean, that's just a really cool thing. But to your point about our daughters, and I think the larger point for this is, what are you optimizing for? That's the phrase that keeps rolling over in my head is, what are you optimizing for? And I think for most people, they are optimizing to impress other people. And I don't think that leads to a successful life. And I think a lot of people want to say, in our case, right? Like we have all these school choices. And what does it mean when your kid gets into an elite school? It means it's a quick proxy signal for, oh, my kid's smart. Look at how great a parent I am, which is very sad. But to a large degree, that's true. Again, these quick signals, a lot of this is signaling. What are you optimizing for? So my older daughter just started high school. And again, she would have had a ton of different options for these elite specialty centers in our district or the governor's school. She would have had as good a chance as anybody in her middle school to get in there. But we stepped off that path because it's, what are you optimizing for? And for her, it was, okay, I can travel across the county and I'm going to be on a bus for an hour and change a day. Or I can go to the amazing high school that's 2 miles down the road and I can be on the marching band. I can be on the varsity swim team, which is the pool is a mile from us, Aaron. And I literally drive Anna there every couple mornings a week at 6:45 in the morning, but we leave at 6:42, right? Again, what are you optimizing for? So we were optimizing for a wonderful school that's a nice neighborhood school. And yeah, I mean, frankly, she is going to be a big fish in a medium-sized pond, we'll say there, but because she's a really bright girl and she does, she tries very, very hard in school. And that's not a bad thing. Knowing her mentality, I think she is probably a big fish in a small pond person, just like I am. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think when you first hear it, you're like, oh, are they not challenging themselves enough? I'm like, no, it's like, again, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for happiness and life satisfaction and being part of a community? There's lots of these things. And that this is a microcosm, obviously. This is just but one example. And I don't mean to harp on it because it is such a microcosm. But the audience out there can hear this and say, oh, what am I optimizing for in X, Y, and Z areas of my life? Maybe I'm doing this because that's what everybody else is doing, or that's what I've always been told. And I think we've tried to be countercultural when it comes to personal finance, but I think that's just the start. I think it extends well beyond that. And if you use that as like this kind of this operating question, what am I optimizing for? I think that's a great launching point.
I agree. And back to that idea we talked about a few minutes ago of every choice you make in Phi is your choice. And so being able to set that destination and make your Phi choice in pursuit of optimizing that next step is a key path to get yourself on individually. And we're very similar. We're community focused, neighborhood minded, so similar decisions. And that for us was an easy decision, even at the middle school level right now, being able to make that choice because of where we had already chosen to optimize and focus.
Yeah. And I love that our girls are going to stay together for a couple of years at the very least. So it's cool.
So let's continue on the trend of talking about kids and the next generation. We've talked about your childhood and growing up all through college. What do you think are the core foundational elements that kids should learn that they're not learning? And maybe some of these are ones you've taught your girls.
That is a very good question, a very broad question. I think for me, and I mean, clearly you can talk about the character issues, just down to, I mean, we do things in our house, like we play board games all the time. And I suspect your question was about personal finance, and I will get back there. But just thinking about like little like Barrett family rules. We have this story of who we are as a family. And one of them is, especially in board games, but this extends, is Barrett's never cheat. Okay. So that would essentially, the girls know, it would essentially be cause for expulsion from the family. And I say that very jokingly, but like cause for expulsion from the family if you ever contemplated or cheated at a board game. So it's totally off the table. It's not even conceivable. And the funny thing is like where this came from, well, aside from it just being a good way to live, clearly, but like my dad always used to joke when we grew up, oh, you cheated. Or, he always had this silly line. And like, he was being funny and joking about it. But like, it always just kind of like rankled me that little bit of like, no, I mean, I would never. And again, he was kidding. So it wasn't like, this is not some kind of childhood trauma by any means, but just like laying down rules of how we live. And I just try to pepper without being that boring, sanctimonious dad of like, this is what, these are the 7 things you do. I just try to like pepper all these lessons in all the time. And for me, another phrase that I like to use, and this sounds a little too like Machiavellian, and I don't mean it that way at all, but it's strategy. That's the word that I use in our house a lot, and I use in my own brain a lot, is what's the best strategy for succeeding here? And that comes down to little 1% differences. So I'll give you a very small example, and then maybe a slightly better example is, okay, when you're driving around, and we don't like to think about this, but the highest likelihood of you dying on a daily basis is in your car. Hard stop, end of story. And I like to say, okay, it's that kind of poker probabilistic nature of how do you think about decision making? And I think this is what I try to pepper in all the time is how can you increase the odds of your success? And again, this is even a worse microcosm than the prior microcosm, but just hear me out because I think it makes sense in that. So I think about like, and I'm not paralyzed by this by any means, but you're driving and you make a turn. If I know I'm going to turn and I'm going to be in the right lane, but I need to get over to the left lane immediately. But when I made my turn, I could have just turned immediately into the left lane. I'm going to turn into that left lane 100 times out of 100 because it lowers that likelihood of when I put my blinker on and I move to that left lane, that somebody's going to be in my blind spot that one time. And I'm going to kick myself for the rest of my life that I just did something stupid. And it was something avoidable because am I ever going to get in an accident at that intersection? In all likelihood, even if I live for 200 more years? No, probably not. But when I make those little decisions over and over and over again, and I increase the likelihood of my success just in life all the time, I think it's going to lead to a better life, just little piece by little piece. And we talk about that aggregation of marginal gains. This is the perfect example of how I think about it, because it's the worst example, to be honest, but it's the perfect example of the thought process, which I think is much more important. So there's that. And then another thing in terms of like strategy, and again, this sounds Machiavellian, but it's not. It's like, how do you want to interact with people? And you think about calling up a customer service representative, or you have a contractor over to the house. Does it make any sense for you to be less than pleasant or grumpy or worse? Do you think that that other person is going to help you or want to go out of their way or give you a good price or do anything for you? Of course they're not. So in this case, the better strategy is to just be pleasant, even if you have to fake it. And then you find, oh, I really like talking to people. Oh, this is fun. Oh, I'm learning something. I'm asking nice questions. Like I'm actually connecting. And then you find, oh, interesting. I'm getting better service. I have relationships. If my power goes out, like it did a couple of weeks ago, as you know, Aaron, I called up my contractor and he was ready to come over at a moment's notice. And again, it's not because I've tried to make this like contrived relationship. No, I mean, like we have a genuine relationship because I ask him questions. He had, like we talk like human beings. Those are the kind of things that like I think my girls see how I kind of go through the world. And a lot of this has been learned on my part. Like my older daughter, Anna, considers me like a great storyteller. If you had asked me 20 years ago, is there ever a world where I would be a great storyteller? I would have laughed at your face because that wasn't me. I was kind of like in my own mind, I was like an introverted guy. Not that introvert is bad by any means, but this is how I conceptualized myself. And it's probably imprecise at this point, but that would not have been plausible. But I built up these skills and I think they see those things. And again, I try to pepper these lessons in. I try to pepper financial lessons in. And, you know, I don't need to belabor all the ones that I do, but it's like, what are they ready for? And how can we make this interesting? And I also don't hide really anything financially from them. And we talk about our own personal finances and we understand, okay, why are we making decisions that we're making? And it's, you know, when you have, just like anyone has finite resources, but significant resources in our cases, why are you making decisions that you're making? And, you know, I'm able to then layer on lessons. This is a larger story that I'll probably tell at another point, but my older daughter, Anna, is now into roller coasters, like massively into roller coasters. She gets very obsessed about things and she's currently extraordinarily obsessed with roller coasters. So it winds up that King's Dominion, which is the park closest to us, is owned by Cedar Fair, which is a publicly traded company. Anna wound up buying some shares of Cedar Fair, and now she follows their financials. And there's a much larger story here, but I was able to then explain lessons to her that would have been horribly boring in a vacuum, but like stock buybacks. I mean, like who's teaching a 14-year-old girl about stock buybacks? Nobody, hopefully. But when I explained it in the sense that, oh, wow, you're a little owner of Cedar Fair and these 11 amusement parks, and they're actually buying back 5% of their stock this year. That means all those shares are off the market and you own a slightly bigger piece. Now, what would happen if they kept doing that every year with the same amount of money, right? And it's like, obviously, the share price would go up by virtue of there being fewer shares, et cetera. And like it would buy fewer shares. So it's not like if they did that for 19 years, she would own the whole company, right? And like I'm playing all of these lessons out. And that was an hour explanation of business through the lens of King's Dominion Amusement Park. And it was awesome. And she loved it. So it's meet your kids where they are and just kind of think about like, how do you live a better life and how do you show them that this is doable and it makes sense to do that as opposed to just kind of being unconscious about it?
I think you said it right there, meeting them where they are and knowing where your North Star is and being able to aggregate and optimize in the direction of that North Star. It takes something different for us to not just think about copying and pasting these life lessons, but how do we take our kids or take each other on these journeys and explore where we're headed, what we could be, the possibilities that are out there. It is exciting.
Yeah, it really is. And it's fun. And it's just like anything with kids, it's a journey, clearly. And I don't have all the answers. Believe me, I'm not trying to make it sound like I've got some master plan here. That's kind of the cool thing is you just, you let it take you where it may. And you can build lessons into things. Like I didn't know that Cedar Fair was publicly traded. And I saw it in the Richmond Times. I'm still like the few dinosaurs that get the tangible paper, which I absolutely love. And I saw it in there as like selected companies of interest. I'm like, oh, we have to go to their website and check this out. And then they have this whole presentation. And I'm sitting there with my 14-year-old going through on the Cedar Fair investor relations page, like this 20-page PowerPoint, but it was super cool. And like we learned all these things about, wow, King's Dominion has 400 acres that are still undeveloped. I wonder what's going to happen. Just all of these cool things. So let interest lead you and you never know where it goes.
Right. And there is so much information out there. I mean, going back to college, the only business class I took at Richmond was accounting. Oh. And the one thing I remember was our assignment was to look up corporate annual reports and analyze them. Now, we were looking primarily at the numbers, but when I go look at those now, so many corporations have turned those into stories where you can learn and explore and find out more about what's happening under the surface and pick up something ourselves just as we're teaching that or sharing that with the next generation.
Yeah. And Aaron, just on that, Warren Buffett's shareholder letters are incredible. And it's funny because if you Google Berkshire Hathaway shareholder letter, it will take you to a website that looks like it was created on the day the internet was created. It's just like ridiculously antiquated page, but it's just like hyperlinks for all the PDFs for his shareholder letters going back decades. And one of my recurring tasks in Todoist, which I've mentioned a ton of times that I use just religiously, is read Buffett's shareholder letter. And I think I have it a little bit ahead of time, but I have it set for recurring February 23rd. So this is coming out. I think it's like right around there, the last week in February, first week in March. But every year, that's like a holiday for me when Mr. Buffett's shareholder letter comes out, because like you said, he's a perfect example. Jeff Bezos is an example. You can read the old Amazon shareholders letters. They basically give you a free MBA if you want to read these over years and decades. And it's pretty cool that these brilliant minds are doing that and just giving this to us for free in essence. So yeah, highly recommend, especially Berkshire letters.
Yeah, the 21st century of communication is so much more interesting than the beginning of the internet.
Yeah, it's wild. It can be a little much, but it's pretty wild most of the time.
So back on episode 419, just a couple episodes ago, you and Dominic were talking about the band of brothers and that human need for community and support. Do you have a low moment, a low point in your Phi experience where you found you needed to lean on that community?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know. I would actually kind of wrap this around maybe something that I'm still looking for in life. And yeah, I guess you could say Phi journey, because it is inextricably tied, is I don't think I've had any point where we had an issue like financially with Phi that I needed to get help. I probably should have, honestly, because I've mentioned a bunch of times in terms of that horrible real estate speculation / investment that went terribly awry. And there probably would have been a way out of that. And it's funny because I took what I thought was like the very like moral stance of, hey, I took out this loan. This is my mistake. I'm paying these things off. And I did. The group of us did. There probably would have been a way to get rid of those in a very legal manner that real estate professionals would have known. So I probably, had I known now, or the people I know now at the time, probably would have ended differently. And it would have been less catastrophic, both financially, but psychologically. Because honestly, I lost a lot of sleep for a lot of years over those things. So yeah, if I had a group, if I had, again, this band of brothers, and I hate to make it so limiting, but it is Dominic's group is a men's group. So it's called the Great Man Mastermind. So that's my specific one. But obviously many of these groups exist for women and combined sexes. But had I had that at the time, it would have been something to talk through, and I would have benefited greatly from it. And then kind of fast forwarding, even to present day, it's hard. People are busy and people have families and things. I mean, do I have the local group of friends and connections who are around all the time that is like my ideal scenario? I think unquestionably the answer is no. And a lot of this is my own, because it's funny, even though I'm a podcast host, I'm not like the most outgoing guy in the world. And like, I don't make friends super easily. Like, I'm never going to be the person like knocking down people's doors, say, hey, come on over. Like, that's just not me. But I kind of wish that I was, and part of that, frankly, is that people are working, right? I'm home, and it's not that I'm not doing anything. I'm doing stuff for Choose a Phi and et cetera. But I have some flexibility, certainly. And yeah, I think that has been a fail, but it's mostly on my side, because there are plenty of people around that I'm friends with that I could get together with on a more frequent basis. Or our Choose a Phi local group is the hey, dummy, that you should be getting in touch with people, right? But do I make that step? No. And sometimes there's just friction. There's friction in your own brain. I think I'm telling this story because I want to make it clear to everybody that like, I don't have it figured all out. I don't know anybody who has everything figured out in their lives, and we're all working on something. Even when you know the answer, sometimes there's still that friction or there's something holding you back. And I think just being cognizant of it is important. And then, like we always say, it's get up off the couch and take action, just even a little bit. It doesn't, again, I'm not going to be the life of the party in our neighborhood 6 months from now, right? Like, I mean, Aaron, there's a 0% chance that will ever happen, because that's not me as a person. But like, could I make steps to do something, to have a fire in the backyard in the fire pit and have people over, or just throw it open to 20 families. And if one family came over, that'd be great, but like, so it's funny that I'm telling you this, obviously, since you live 3 doors down, and it's, I would be saying this regardless of whether you live 300 miles or 3 doors down, but that is really, truly one thing that I definitely have to work on.
Oh, and you and I have talked about, hey, let's have that happy hour or that coffee. And
we never do.
We pass on the street and we're walking somewhere or picking the kids up. And yes. And I think back, I mentioned this a little bit ago, but there are so many different perspectives that each of us have. And we're not all 100% at everything, gifted, talented, able, however you frame it. And so there is power in the community to recognize, hey, who is that catalyst for connecting and building community around us? And, all of us can do that in small pieces here and there. But like you said, you are not going to completely flip the script and become the neighborhood connector. Though I do still look at 1 or 2, maybe 3 of the neighborhood gatherings we had pre-COVID at your house. And I still point back and think, oh, I met that family on the Barrett's back porch. Huh. Oh, I met that family in the Barrett's living room. And so
that's cool.
There's a bite size taking that small step that all of us, it gets us off the starting block. And sometimes we just have to pivot and reframe where we're coming from.
Yeah.
So jumping off of that, you talked about the community and you and Dominic talked about your bold move. Have you made any progress in what your bold move is for this year?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I was very much struggling. So yeah, that episode with Dom came out in early to mid-January. But yeah, we recorded it in December. And in my kind of odd way, I was very stressed out about this bold move, which is so ridiculous and antithetical to what we're doing here. But nevertheless, that's, the human condition in my own brain. And Dom, and the way he explained it, and I would advise everybody to go back and listen to that if you haven't, but the way he explained it kind of gave me some latitude to not have a precise, like this is January 1st. I know exactly what the bold move is. I can tell you what success is going to look like on December 31st. He talked about this 100 push-up challenge that he created, and then it kind of morphed into raising a significant amount of money for a charity. And I don't think he envisioned at the outset that it was going to be that charitable portion. So for me, I think where I am, my kind of overall operating theme is, I've been saying best shape ever, but I think that sounds too limiting. I just want it like healthiest year ever. And I don't know what that's going to look like right now, but I think what it practically looks like is a year of exploration for me. And this also ties into the Die with Zero book, because I am in a fortunate position where I have a significant net worth, and I do still have businesses that bring in some money. I can afford to spend some money. And especially, it's not like I'm getting any younger. I'm going to turn 44 this year. And let's be clear, I'm in pretty good shape. So it's not like I have something terrible to overcome. I'm healthy, et cetera. But if I can expand that time where I'm still very, very healthy from maybe 44 to 70 to 44 to 75 or 80 or whatever. And I don't want to be limiting and say that every 72-year-old is not healthy. Clearly, I'm not saying that. So lest anybody hear that and want to jump through your phone and crush me, I'm not saying that at all. But I don't want to be penny wise, pound foolish. So I'm trying to just explore. And I think what some of those things are is I watched, and if anybody's on my Choose a Phi weekly newsletter, which I highly recommend. I write that myself every Monday. It goes out every Tuesday morning. So choosephi.com/subscribe. I talked about, I guess, a National Geographic special called Limitless with Chris Hemsworth. And Aaron, I don't know if you've watched this yet, but it's on Disney Plus, and it's phenomenal. It is a 6-part series. And it's basically Chris Hemsworth following through on different aspects of health and longevity. So it's all of these little, like, each episode is devoted to a different thing. One is strength, one is memory, one is tackling cold, one is actually fasting. And a bunch of guys in my mastermind group saw this and said, oh, that's interesting. I would never do this on my own, but maybe if we did it together as an accountability group, we could do it. So I actually did a 4-day fast, which was wild. It was January 1st through January 5th. This was done under medical supervision. So again, a lot of people hear that. And I'm not saying to go out and do that tomorrow and just not drink any water and nothing like that. We did it this is medically supervised. But it was fantastic. And it gave me a real insight into a lot of my own cues mentally, both hunger, boredom, when I think I'm hungry and things like that. And also just resilience and accountability. Because I would have given up long before the 4 days when I had proved to myself that I had done this. So like on the 3rd day, Aaron, I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? I was just so annoyed. Like, I've proven to myself I can do it. I'm just going to stop. But then the other 5 guys were still rocking and rolling, and I wasn't going to stop. So, that made me rethink this like healthiest year ever from like best shape ever, because that was how I originally conceptualized it. And like, I don't want to look like it's not like a vanity thing. It's just, like, I want to be healthy. And like, what does that mean? So, I could give you a 30-minute explanation here, but we'll stop there, and I'll keep everybody updated over the year.
Well, that's good. There's power in community. And I've found this. There's a study out there about how successful we are at implementing the ideas that we think about. And if we think about it, we're very minimally likely to succeed. If we tell somebody else, it maybe doubles. And we're talking in the order of like 10 to 20% likelihood. But if you want to get to 98%, 99%, according to this study, likelihood of success, it's having someone else who you're putting a date on the calendar to follow up on this.
Ooh.
And so you mentioning to this entire community and your mastermind and whoever else you're talking with, that's where the power comes in, is that we are sharing this journey and experience with someone else and committing to the follow-up of somebody else who's going to check in on us and see how are things going. And so there's truly power in that I think a lot of times when we think about the aggregation of looking at our purpose and where we're headed, we can fall off the wagon a little bit by not sticking with it.
Yeah, agreed. I think that accountability, it's proven to me that it is remarkably powerful. So yeah, just a good life lesson generally.
Well, we have covered lots of ground, almost your entire life journey, including the next 30 years. You pursue being that 74-year-old fit. And I'll introduce you to a guy locally who is in his 70s, super fit, and probably the epitome of everything that you and I should both want to be when we're that age.
Amazing. That sounds like a perfect mentor. And yeah, just to reiterate again, I'm not saying to anybody in their 70s that you are not fit, healthy. Believe me, that is something aspirational. I think you have to work very hard because the reality is we lose muscle every year after, I think it's like after 35 or something. So you have to work very hard. So people who are fit and healthy, that is an extraordinary testament to how you live your life. And I think it's very, very doable for all of us, but we have to be intentional, just like anything in Phi and in life. You have to be intentional. You can't just kind of sleepwalk because you're going to sleepwalk into sarcopenia to the point where you have essentially no muscle. And that's a negative feedback loop of, oh, I don't want to get out of the house. I don't want to walk around. So like that is something that I'm trying very, very hard to be intentional about decades before I have to worry about it. And then I think just like most of us could be very healthy 80-year-old. So that's the goal. So you can tell I'm giving caveat after caveat here because I'm not a limited thinker. Like I don't think that way. But when you look around, you see the result of the lack of intentionality. And I think that's the point. Whereas you go to a culture like Japan and you see people in their 80s and 90s walking around gardening and doing like this is very doable, but there has to be some intention.
I always joke, I was most surprised. My eye doctor, my podiatrist, and one other doctor, all right around the time in my early 30s, they said, well, it's downhill from 30. And that's just so counter to how we've been raised up, trained, conditioned to think about health and fitness and well-being. But as you talked about, there is a downhill slope from adulthood that we do have to be intentional about. All right, let's get outside of Phi. Let's get outside of family, big picture. What else is fascinating you these days, drawing your attention, pulling you in? You talked about Limitless on Disney Plus. Anything else catching your attention?
That is a great question, Aaron. I feel like a lot of the things that I've been really fascinated by, I've actually kind of peppered in here in the last hour, just kind of randomly in, the Bill Perkins book, The Die with Zero, clearly the Limitless and the health. One thing I've been exploring with that is I'm a huge fan of Dr. Peter Attia, who I've mentioned a bunch of times. He has a podcast called The Drive, which is silly. He's like a major Formula One fan, but it's a health and longevity podcast essentially. And he's talked for years about doing a lot of like very difficult physical performance challenges, like swimming like 20 miles and just, he's like a big into boxing and deadlifting 500 pounds. And like he basically shut it all down a couple years ago in favor of this rehabilitation program called DNS. So it's dynamic neuromuscular stabilization. It's just kind of like reworking your motor pattern. So actually, this is along the line of healthiest year ever. Is I actually got really lucky and found there aren't that many DNS doctors in the whole country. And there is one here in Richmond. And I've been going recently, and it's just this like transformative thing. And I feel better than I've felt in a long time. So, it sounds kind of kooky when you hear about it, but it is basically reworking these motor patterns of your development in essence as like an infant from like 0 to 18 months. And like, if you missed a developmental stage, it doesn't mean you're going to get stuck there and not be able to like walk or crawl or anything. It just means your body's going to compensate. And a lot of us compensate in the same ways in terms of hunched shoulders and then tight hip flexors and things like that. So I have been experimenting with this and going there weekly now, and it's made a massive difference. So it's not necessarily for everybody, obviously, and most likely you're not going to have a DNS practitioner near you. But if you struggle with just tightness in your body, like it might be something worth looking into. So yeah, I've just been really kind of just thinking outside the box of like, and it's not like focusing on negative by any means, but like, what are these areas that I just take as like background noise or like, oh, that's the way I am, and maybe trying to figure out, is there a way around that? Or like, Are there things that I want to do that I otherwise wouldn't have because it's a 15-minute drive or it costs a little bit of money? Again, healthiest year ever. There's a gym a couple miles from us that is, it's not like super duper expensive, but it's not cheap. It's not the $10 a month Crunch Fitness. And they have a sauna and a steam room at this gym. And I actually joined recently. And again, like, is that what people would think of as the caricature of Phi? Like, I'm spending $80 a month in essence to get a sauna and a steam room plus this amazing gym. So, don't cry for me. But the decision was for the sauna and the steam room. And I'm thrilled with that decision because it's fantastic. I'm meeting you just meet random people and have these conversations, or you meditate in the sauna for 20 minutes. And I'm just trying to think outside the box a little bit. So I guess probably not the greatest answer to your question, but I've also been trying to just get back to reading, which I haven't done. Like, I love fiction, and I just have been reading nonfiction for so long. And it's not in like this weird, like, oh, I need to better myself at all times. That's just what I've been doing, like the things that have come across my plate. And I think it just feels good to get back to some good old fashioned fiction. I read a book called Upgrade. I think it's by author Blake Crouch. I like a lot of just kind of like sci-fi or fantasy. So I've been reading the Witcher books, which are, I guess there's a Netflix series on The Witcher. So that's been kind of cool. And yeah, you know me, as always, I'm just taking in a lot of podcasts and such, with maybe too many. But yeah, as always, I think one of the best ways is to just bring in like a broad swath of information. And I like to just kind of let my brain synthesize things and just kind of like make connections. I try not to overload myself, certainly, but you never know what you're going to find out there. So yeah, that's just kind of how, I guess, another one of my random operating principles.
Well, as we've talked about throughout, the operating principles are so key in figuring out what it is that you are optimizing for. And I think this has been a really good conversation. I've enjoyed it. I hope those of you listening have taken something away to figure out of Brad's story and his experience. What are you optimizing for? What steps are you taking? Where do you want to go? And how can you get that 1% better in your next step, however long it takes? Not getting locked in with having a bold move for the year on January 1st, but figuring out in your time and in your way, what's your next step? Where are you headed? Who can you become? And who do you want to become? And being open to that. So Brad, thanks for taking a stab at sitting down on the hot seat. Thanks for playing along with me, covering you with questions seemingly from out of left field. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, Aaron, I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, maybe we can do a round two. Certainly, if you come up with other questions, I feel like I'm going to kick myself after for not answering one or two of them that I feel like right on the tip of my tongue, the answer, especially to that, what are you exploring recently? But, or to the audience, if you want me to kind of do an AMA on just kind of random stuff like this or Phi, we actually set up a separate email. It's ask@chooseafy.com. So ASK, ask@chooseafy.com. Just send stuff in, especially, yeah, if you want to see something like this, another kind of turn the tables episode, or yeah, some combination of maybe my kind of hot takes on, I don't know, the housing market. I've got, it's funny, Aaron, my wife always jokes. She's like, you're so calm and cool on the podcast, but you're so incredibly opinionated in real life. And I don't know if that comes across on the podcast quite as much. So yeah, I definitely, especially now that I'm the solo host of the show, maybe we'll get into some more of those. But yeah, Aaron, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. This is fun. I guess let everybody know where they can find you, because you actually have a podcast of your own.
Yeah, I'm the host of the New Generation Leader podcast. Great conversations like this one with coaches, leaders, practitioners in the leadership and team development field. So you can find that on your favorite platform, the New Generation Leader, or newgenerationleader.com/podcast.
Cool. Well, obviously, everybody can hear what a good podcast host you are from this episode. And yeah, that sounds wonderful. New Generation Leader. Aaron, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And obviously, I'll see you at the bus stop here probably in a couple hours or tomorrow morning or something. And yeah, to the audience, as always, thank you for being here.